So in a previous video, I made Samus's arm cannon from the Metroid series, and while I'm really proud of this and think I did a good job, it's not great on its own. You need more of the costume. So I decided to make the rest of the costume. I managed to find online a model of the helmet and of the shoulders. There was a model of the rest of the suit too, but I decided to go a different route instead of 3D printing the whole thing. I'm going to make it out of Eva foam. So in this series of videos, I'm going to go over how I made that whole suit. We'll start with the helmet and the shoulders because they were honestly the easiest with just needing to print and paint and so on. Let's crack into it. So I got this bottle from do3d.com, and while it does come in a single hole, that's too big for my printer. So I picked the option where it's split into 6 pieces, and each of those fits comfortably within my printer, which is a Creality CR10 V3, and I'm going to print them all separately. The problem is they don't connect together well. I could glue them along those really thin edges that you see, but that's good. That's a recipe for snapping. So I need to model some way of joining them together. The idea that I came up with was to have little panels, as you can see there on the left, that go between the 2 pieces along the join, and then I can have half of it embedded in, and then put little rectangles of the same shape that join and screw them in over the top.
So here's the 2 halves of the helmet. Nice 3mm bolt fits in nicely there. I've printed these little covers that just go over the bolt holes that I made, and I've just put 2 together. It's not perfect. You can see a bit of a gap here at the top, and it's not perfectly aligned at either end, but yeah, it holds together and it stays out of the way. Perfect.
So once all of those were printed, and gee, it took them a while, each of these pieces is really huge with a lot of supports, and I had a lot of mess ups. Once they were all printed, I need to sand down all the edges to make sure they smoothly fit together, and then sand all the pieces further for painting. The cleaning process took a lot. A lot of the supports didn't come off cleanly, and there's all sorts of awkward shapes and bits lodged into corners and so on. So this was more involved than I wanted it to be, and it did result in a few bunglings on certain parts.
Alright, so by and large, I've fixed up most of all these pieces, and all the little bits about them are good. So now it's time to really start sanding them down, getting them ready for painting. I've got that the wrong way. Always plug in power the right way.
This sanding was difficult too, again, because there were a lot of curves and I don't get a nice planar surface. But then also there were some 3D printed aberrations, which I can show later, that basically meant to grind them down to a flat surface, I'd have to grind way too much plastic away. So I was kind of hoping that the paint, I used filler paint, and it would just fill those gaps, and it didn't, but I think it's good enough. There was also, little rivets around the helmet. There were the joining gaps and curvy details on the front that just made it a bit of a nightmare to cleanly sand everything. But I'm relatively happy with the result. I would have loved to have watched Frankly Built print and sand this in more detail to see how he got his finish so clean compared to mine. And maybe he's just printed in better detail in the first place.
Alright, so I have all my pieces of the helmet, and I started painting the side bits and then realized, no, I want to put it together before I paint it, so that the paint sort of fills in the seams, because I'm not planning on taking this apart again. So we bolt it all together, we start painting. There's still a few little edge bits that I need to fits up, but I want to see how it fits all together first and how it looks, because then I might need to do up more.
So finally, we screw it all together. There are a few little adjustments where parts need to be tweaked and twisted, but this, as expected, I suppose, fit together really nicely, and it made me really pleased with this as a solution. I did run out of 3mm bolts though. This used up a lot of my supply. And here's how it fits onto my head. There's not much room for my head to get through that gap, but there's enough, and I certainly wouldn't want it any bigger. There is a lot of empty space inside there.
So I've done an underlayer of the primer and the gold, just to give the red a nice base. I think it's pretty good. There are still some aberrations that neither sanding nor paint could really get rid of. But time to start the red, and we'll see how it looks.
The red paint ended up looking really, really good. I frankly built did a better job. His was a lot more clean, but I'm happy with how mine ended up. You really have to be gentle with this paint, not do too much. So what I'm doing here is working on the visor. I got some colored transparency sheets that you put on an overhead projector or on lights to add a bit of color to them. And I tested with the yellow and the yellowish green. Samus's visor is a strong green, but I wanted to make a test piece first. And this also looks somewhat close. The process was basically just sticking it in there, drawing out the outline of what I wanted, cutting it down, and then just iteratively cutting bits off until it fit really cleanly. And then finally, I didn't actually glue the final thing in. I put pieces of foam around the edges that would hold it down, and then bent it and slipped it in behind those. Then once I was happy with the shape of the yellow one, I traced out the green and cut it out. Continually comparing to the online photos I had.
So, finally got a respirator nose piece, because if you watched in the games closely, she has a respirator piece sort of sitting somewhere there. Now this is awkward to fit in, and to be honest, it's not going to be like properly flush over my nose when inside the helmet, but also I'm not trying to like filter the air and breathe perfectly. I actually want to breathe easier. I don't want this over. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of gently glue it in there, and it won't be covering, it'll be sort of in front of this. It's going to make talking hard, impossible, but kind of don't care. If I'm trying to talk to people, I'm going to take this off anyway, because it's already difficult. But it gives that look that I've got the respirator, which is what I'm going for. And then finally, I really don't want a strap under the chin or anything, but this helmet is so cavernous. The only way it's going to fit nicely under my head is I'm going to basically pad around the head with foam and glue that in so it just sits on my head nicely. It does make it very specific to my head, but at the same time, like, this is for me and I'm wearing it. I'm allowed to do the crap like that.
The respirator, as with the other foam pieces, padding on the inside, was just hot glued in. It's a little flimsy, but once my face is in there, everything just holds together and doesn't fall out. Finally, I just glued loads of EVA foam on the inside to pad the helmet enough so that it wouldn't rock on my head. In its default state, it's sort of balanced on this single point on the top of my head. This added enough around the edges such that it couldn't actually shift forwards or backwards. There was only one realistic spot where it would sit, and it sat there quite stably. This is what I wanted.
Okay, so I've already started painting it, as you can see, but I printed the shoulder piece. Print it at 1mm nozzle, not anything smaller, because it just takes so long
And I tried a few different sizes and densities. One was a bit smaller than this, and it's just so heavy. It's insane. Um, yeah, I'm pretty happy with how this is ending up. And then I'm going to have straps across my chest, which you can see in the photos I'll put on the screen. Whoop, to hold it up. I've already started painting it because I'm not going to be able to sand in the divots, whatever you want to call them. So I've started painting those to see if I would be able to avoid sanding them. And I think for the most part, except for the really rough bits, I can just make the paint thick enough to not sand. Anyway, I'm gonna sand the rest of it, ready for spray painting, which is just gonna take a while. This thing has so much surface area. Although on some parts, it's actually fairly smooth and you don't need the sanding per se, but need to be complete. I probably should have not glued this in beforehand, but it is what it is. So let's sand. Probably could have sanded it more in retrospect, just because, like I pointed out, on the curves, it was really hard to be complete and to get all the little bits. And so maybe I should have done another sanding layer with 60 or 120 before going super fine. But because you can still see some of the 3D print lines. Again, we're doing layers of filler primer to hopefully fill all the tiny little holes, which semi-worked. And then the orange paint was orange metal cast. You can see on the sides, I did it a little too thick at times and it ran. No matter, no one notices that. It's my first one, second after the helmet. And then I just manually black painted those inset lines. And finally, I did one layer of clear cast just to really spruce it up and give it that show. I used elastic in the end instead of a rigid strap to hold them onto my shoulders. This was much better because then I didn't have to try and ratchet it tight. I could just stretch the elastic once, snap it in, and then it would hold. In the end, despite the paint running and some errors with the 3D printing and little details that don't look great close up, I'm quite happy with the helmet and the shoulders. They're what people notice first and foremost, and they look fantastic. Next, on to the rest of the suit.